Welcome to Reroll Multiple Martial Arts, a podcast that discusses the intersection between martial arts, society, and culture. Well, I'm Elliot.
Danny,
How are you doing, Danny?
I'm doing good, man. A little bit, as good as it can be. I think everyone in the United States, as well as the world, is keeping an eye on what's going on locally and nationally. So it's a little bit, like I say, when I take inventory, I'm okay. I'm good. But in terms of like being honest, I'm a little bit frazzled, a little bit kind of frustrated, and also I think, just trying to figure out where this moment fits in this podcast in particular. We talked about setting this place up as a space for us to talk about martial arts in general, society, our participation, and be ourselves, which are people that have invested a lot in thinking about society. And as we were getting ready to do our third episode, I wasn't sure if we should talk about the killing of George Floyd, the uprising, the community response, and I feel more comfortable now saying I think we should, because I don't know, it would be disingenuous, in the people we are, to pretend that we're not aware of what literally is happening outside, where I'm recording. Just yesterday and even the day before, there were rallies and there was police response. I could hear tear gas. I could hear rubber bullets. So I think we should talk a little bit about that.
No, I completely agree. I mean, especially with, martial arts is an intersection of everybody, all walks of life, participates in martial arts. And I think it needs to be discussed. I don't think it's discussed enough in martial arts circles. And, it might not be comfortable for some people, but it's something that's really important because, every gym is different. Every gym has a different culture. And I think it's healthy, where do you want to start with discussing, the issues at hand with martial arts?
What if we frame it this way? So in the past two episodes, we have been slowly unraveling our respective journeys and experiences with martial arts. And one of the things that I have noticed is that there's a high degree of investment and involvement between police departments and martial arts in two formats. One, the training of police officers by martial artists and by martial art fields and disciplines. As an example, you would say like judo has a strong history of being the martial art that Japan used for its police force, kendo as well, so that if you were a police officer in Japan, you were a judoka. You were also a kendo martial artist. And for those that don't know what kendo is, it is the art of drawing the sword. So that it was one and the same for many people. And then the other part of that intersection or high degree of involvement is the way that many of us are not necessarily interested in becoming police officers. Yet what we find is that there are many police officers in the martial art fields that we're in, the disciplines we're in, and there's also a lot of police department sponsorship. So that in many martial arts schools, you will see a plaque where the police department kind of co-sponsors the kids. They'll do little events, fundraisers. So there's that weird intersection. And I think it is important, or it's definitely significant enough that we can address that.
Well, I totally agree. I mean, some gyms, they offer, discounts for, law enforcement and stuff like that. And I don't know. I mean, like on one hand, it could help some people keep a level-headed, cool in a tense situation. I mean, I think that's what's great about martial arts is staying cool and keeping calm. But at the same time, I mean, that's not necessarily the case with everybody. Everybody has a different approach to martial arts. There are some people that I would like to spar with, and some people that I prefer not to spar with. And yeah, everybody has a different approach. And um, I mean, yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
Well, here's what I'm thinking. Like, as we talk about it today, I want to return to how we started. So in our very first episode, we were very honest that our take toward martial art is not necessarily the same as what I would argue is the general narrative of martial arts. And the general narrative of martial arts is that it is a place for people that want to fight, a place that tough guys and tough women go into. And that's true. I think to be a martial artist is to give you credit as someone that can endure a lot. But you're also someone that is very loving. You're someone that is very caring. You're someone that is into peace and not violence. So that's how I think of myself when I think about a martial artist. I see myself as someone that has invested over 30 years of my life in a martial art of some kind. And every time I was in a specific place, I can only recall one moment, one specific training session where I realized this was not for me. The teacher was, if it makes sense, it's kind of silly, but do you remember the Karate Kid, the Cobra Kai dojo?
Yeah, strike
like
first.
That. Elliot, it was like that. It was ridiculous. I was older, so I wasn't a 13-year-old boy, but I was in my 20s. And I had to leave because I realized I could not return. It was good training, good technique. It just was not the space that I could commit myself going every day and interacting in a very loving and respectful way when the sensei was creating a space that was not positive. And anyway, so I want to return back to this conversation and I'll pose it to you. Where are you right now? How are you feeling about what is happening in our local cities at the national level in response to the killing of George Floyd by a police officer?
First, I want to say that it is inspiring to see so many people exercise their voices and to speak out against police violence and the system, like a corrupt system. And people of all like walks of life, people who I didn't think were quote unquote political, like people all over the world have their eyes on the United States. And people, it's inspiring, like to see that people care, like people in, martial artists in Canada and people like gyms and places in Thailand, like, like expressing their support for Black Lives Matter. And, it is frustrating. It is, I'm angered by, so much, so much that has been swept under the rug by police departments and law enforcement agencies. But people are fed up. It's been a long time coming, and I'm. It's unfortunate that it took something like this to spark such a huge reaction and such a huge unity among people. Granted, there are opportunists who are trying to stir stupid stuff. And, there are people who are posing as protesters when they're actually, white supremacists. But I really, even with all the bad, I think it is a great exercise of, free speech and, power to the people.
No, I think it's really interesting to reflect on how this moment it's visceral. I am one of those few that didn't see the video. I saw the still photo of the police officer and the position. What I couldn't commit myself was to seeing the video, and I just couldn't, man. My heart was just like destroyed. Even as I speak, I feel my body just getting overwhelmed with emotion because it feels so upsetting to know that that level of violence is state sanctioned by a police force that should be better trained. And what I want to pose for you is, and let me know if it's inappropriate, just to bring it back to the topic of this segment, where we're trying to talk about martial arts and how it addresses our sense of understanding our place in society. How did you feel about seeing that from a perspective of a martial artist or a martial art filter?
First, that the officer could have benefited from training. I mean, there's a lot of officers that, for example, Brazilian jiu-jitsu teaches to control a situation. I mean, what I'm saying is not unique to myself, but I mean, say like, with, Muay Thai or kickboxing or something, that's just teaching how to squash something really quickly, an elbow, a knee, a kick. That's just kind of like using violence, arguably. But with jiu-jitsu, it's knowing how to lock up a person to prevent them from moving any further. To know the threshold of pain to stop the person from moving without, breaking an arm or, ripping any like tendons or pulling something out of a socket. Like, and to see that, officer, gosh, name slips my mind, put a knee on Floyd's neck. I mean, it's terrible. I mean, someone with proper martial arts training knows that that's completely inappropriate. We don't do that stuff. And to be honest, I did not see the full video. I did not see the whole thing. I've seen other videos of people getting killed. I watched the, Ahmaud Arbery video. I mean, I like you, Danny. I couldn't watch the whole thing and watch this person die on film. Like it was a bit much for me. Yeah. How about you?
Well, I was thinking about what I saw, and there's a couple things that I would like to kind of consider as part of the conversation. One has to do with how the police force historically has systematically used violence upon Black and brown bodies, Native bodies, women, the poor, in a different way than they do with wealthy, white, straight men. So it's difficult for me to consider an evaluation of what is proper training for the police force without thinking that the police force historically has been trained to treat people differently. And many times, people will say that there's nothing in the books telling them to treat people differently. But when something is reproduced so well, there must be a culture, there must be a systemic way of instructing people to reproduce that. And that's what we know has historically been the case. that the police departments throughout the United States have treated black and brown bodies, black and brown men, in a way that was elevated in degrees of violence and degrees of harm, degrees of humiliation, and degrees of intimidation. So I feel that what the police officer in question, his name is Derek Chauvin, this person, I don't know if he's going to say I was following proper procedure. One of the things I noticed is that there are many pictures of police officers putting their knees on people's necks as a hold. I don't know when that happened as training, because I'd like to talk about how martial arts and police are intertwined, because police officers take martial arts as part of their job duties. And some of them are going to be trained in the academy. The academy will provide a level of training that changes by generation. There was a time in Los Angeles where police officers were using nunchucks. Those nunchucks that we see in TV, the ones that Bruce Lee, as a martial artist and film star, made very famous. It seems ridiculous, Elliot, that police officers carry nunchucks as part of standard issue. And you know what they were doing is they were choking people, Elliot. That's what stopped them. Eventually, that's what stopped their use, because one, the nunchuck, if you've seen the movies, it's a striking tool. So yes, you can hurt people by striking them, swinging it. But it was also used to contain, to hold people down, and to choke them. And the people that were being choked were not rich men, white coating. Those were not the ones that were being choked. The ones that were being choked and were filing cases of civil rights abuses, police brutality abuse, were men and women of color, poor men and women of color. So I think that the training changes, but yet it follows the same pattern of violence. And my experience with training is I've always had police officers in my dojos. I've never had them as a teacher. I've had them as senpais, which means they were older senior students who took on a role of caretaking and leadership. And I've had them as peers. And one of the things that I remember early on is that they were in the martial arts because they were supplementing their training. So when we were changing, they would always have stories. They would have stories of like, oh, this weekend I used this. This weekend, this one move came in handy. And at the beginning, I was going to say I was unaware, but it's not true. I'm thinking about the very first time that I heard someone talk about a police officer killing someone. And it was right about the same time I took the first martial art class. I was 13. I was in junior high. I was on a bus. There was going to be a rally. And that was right about that time I took my first martial art class. So I've never had a moment where those two things weren't together. But I do notice that a pattern where there's a high degree of involvement by police officers and martial arts training. And sometimes it's part of the official program of training, but most of the time it was a supplement. It was the way that they were building new skill sets. And I think that that's something that needs to be addressed. But I'm also concerned that it may come off kind of weird, because like, I don't think people understand that martial arts and police are not necessarily the same.
No, I completely agree. One aspect I was thinking was, the accountability aspect in a martial arts gym or a dojo where I've had teachers or I guess people, let's just say teachers for lack of better words, say that what they're teaching is not for us to use out on the street, and it is, if they hear of us doing something to other people, you know that there will be consequences, in the gym. And I think there's a with martial arts there is a sense of restraint. We're trained for I don't want to say a last resort, but it's self-defense, and in a way where there's control because we know how to control our bodies. There is a limit, within this martial arts space. There's a limit of what we can do and should do. There's a sense of respect, and without that framework, and just taking the physical aspect, taking the fighting aspect in martial arts and just putting in another space, is dangerous and can be very dangerous. This is the teaching of hurting and killing somebody, and it's like you said, in a previous episode, what's the difference between martial arts and fighting? There's a control of martial arts, and fighting, it's a lack of control.
I'm remembering my teacher. I've had several teachers, and I just remembered, I said earlier that I never had a teacher who was a police officer, but I forgot that I did. I did have one instructor who was a sheriff, I believe. And his instruction was in line with what he used on the field. And I remember thinking about, how he talked about martial arts. He talked about it in a way that was like, this is what will save your life, because this is what saves my life. So I'm going to kind of sound like I don't know how it sounds, but I'm just going to say it. So I understand that when you're a police officer, and these are the police officers that I've met. So I'm only speaking about the 5 or 7 people that I've had in my life that I've trained with, and they would talk about what it meant for them to be in the dojo. And it was the place of safety where they could prepare to protect themselves when they were not in a place of safety on patrol. And what I struggle with is this divide, which is this. When they were sharing space with me in the dojo, I was not in the police academy. So it was like bringing something out of context, because I could, for example, like I remember there was this one guy in LA. He was a LAPD officer, and at that time I was doing Shotokan, and it was always like that. When we would go into our drills, I remember he would like get really hyped. He's like, come at me. And at one point he said, if you don't hit me, I'm going to hit you. And I was like, dude, this is this serious. But he was really intense. Mm-hmm. And then I'm just thinking, like, for him, this was training for his job. But I was not. I was a teacher at that time. I was teaching little kids. And then at night I would go to Shotokan. Way out of context. So I'm just kind of struggling with this place of thinking about the intersection of martial art as this discipline that is based in combat, but also the state operated police force that most of the time isn't even bringing in martial arts to train them specifically. But the police officers go out to get supplemental training. So they bring in that to their side. And that's what's making me a little bit uncomfortable about the conversation, because I'm struggling to make sense of how do we process when we meet? Because there's very few places like that. Like, for example, I'm a teacher, and maybe I go to you on a book club. But if I start saying like, this is training for my class, you would check me and go like, this isn't your class, Danny. This is just a poetry reading. I know you're going to use it, but you're out of context. And that's how I felt. I felt out of context, but I think there's something there about like processing it. So I'm curious, how do you make sense of it? I mean, do you feel that these are spaces that can work together? They can't? They're exclusive, inclusive?
Whenever, recently I think the San Francisco police chief banned the thin blue line image on police officer face masks, because the thin blue line image is a political statement, and police officers, public servants are not allowed to express political statements on the job because they're funded by taxpayers. But when there are certain gyms that have that thin blue line flag hanging, and I would personally not go to a gym like that, because it promotes the blue code of silence. First off, that means a lack of accountability. Blue code of silence meaning if you see, if an officer sees another officer do something wrong, they're not going to say anything to protect their fellow officer. And I think that's terrible. That's not how things should work. I mean, if there's a public school teacher doing something shady, I would hope that the other teachers would call them out, report them, and have disciplinary action, proper disciplinary action. And I expect much more from law enforcement. That's they're holding guns, they're enforcing particular law. But so yeah, I mean, I think inside a martial arts space, I think it should respect all walks of life. It should be inclusive. It should be a place where I feel comfortable expressing myself, and not kind of look over my shoulder and just kind of like, oh, did I say something wrong, or is there something it's tough sometimes. It's tough a lot of times. I've trained in places where it's very intertwined, and I've trained in places where it is not so intertwined. Lately, there's a gym in Los Angeles, and I think is really cool. One of the trainers there, who is a pro MMA fighter, recognized. The name is very recognizable, and when the Ahmaud Arbery situation became public, he posted about it. He was like, dude, this is not cool. It's, justice must be served. I mean, and that's great. There's not enough coaches or trainers or pro fighters that are speaking about it. Sports is notorious for avoiding politics, and so and I feel like there is space is very important. Another thing was that there's the member of this gym, there's a public defender there, and people say hi to him all the time. I'm like, man, this guy's like the local cool guy. And public defenders protect the people, namely against cops, and people love him at the gym, and that's cool. Symbolically, that's amazing, because I like to go to a gym where the public defender is recognized. A lot of times they're not, but I'm happy to share a space like that.
I think it's important to consider just what you mentioned is the space of the gym. When we think about martial arts, the space has changed a lot. So that the very first class I took was in a Salvation Army Community Center, Rec Center. We probably paid $5 a month. And if you didn't have money, you could still train. And before that, if we look at the history of martial arts, there were different spaces for it. There were people that were trained as fighters because they were part of a military force, whether it be a king, a dictator, a president, a ruler. But most of the people weren't being systematically instructed how to fight. There were families that had a martial art that they had developed, and they would pass it on to their loved ones in a very safe space. So there's martial arts that were born out of resistance to oppression. We can think about the Okinawan martial art narrative, the empty hand. The reason they developed that style was because they were unable legally, once Japan had occupied the island, to hold weapons. So when we think about martial arts and the police, I think we have to recognize that deep history of different communities sharing that space, so that when you talk about us going to a gym, I feel that most of us are aware that gyms by default cater to the police force. There's a lot of discounts given to the police. And I want to be clear that this is not me speaking in this narrative of like police should not train. I do feel that they should know where to train, because training with someone that feels scared by the police because the police has terrorized their neighborhood, it's difficult to find a place. That you described a place that someone can be openly supportive of a movement of holding police accountable. I don't think there's a lot of gyms like that. I think a lot of gyms, the people are keeping quiet because the police hold the priority. And I think that's the direction that a lot of us maybe are looking for a place to have training, but also to be authentically sincere, so that when I train, I can speak and say, hey, I feel that the police should be held accountable, and then not feel that my sensei is going to reprimand me and kick me out because he's going to say, oh, you're anti-police, get out. It's like, well, how come that police officer can come and train and tell us about how many people he put in handcuffs today, and you're cheering him on?
No, I agree. I mean, this also, this is for another episode, but it, relates to, issues of toxic masculinity and, in mixed martial arts and or in the gym, and, treating women different and XYZ. I think there's it branches all into those issues that we can talk about another time.
As we kind of think about, today, maybe maybe people that are kind of tuning in for the first time are kind of a little bit confused as to how is this related to martial arts. We started the conversation by feeling that we need to be sincere that as of this recording, all over the United States, people are uprising to hold police accountable. And I guess we could have just had that conversation on its own, but here I was trying to think about how does that intersect with the topic of martial arts? And one of the ways that for me, it intersected immediately was with people saying that police officer is a trained individual representing the state. The state with the little s, but the state apparatus, the government, the legitimate, entity that holds that power, so that a regular human being without that badge would never even have been able to get to that position. The position of power literally was also granted submission because of the badge. The fact that this person is able to put his knee on another human being's neck without other people pushing him off is because there was all of that together, and I think when we think about martial arts, it is a place where we have to think about not just the discipline of fighting, but a discipline that is immersed in the society, so that every martial art that we reference has a history. You think about Muay Thai. Muay Thai has a long history of resistance. It gives anchor to these warriors that fought oppressive forces entering their villages. I mentioned Okinawa martial arts, the same thing. There's a narrative of resistance in that martial art.
Yeah, it's funny because Krav Maga was developed by Jewish people to protect themselves in the in Jewish ghetto in around the Germany around the 30s and 40s. But then you hear Krav Maga now, and it's become a tool of the state of Israel to oppress other people, and it's interesting how different. It's interesting how things evolve.
It is, and maybe that's where we are right now, trying to make sense of how martial arts plays out in policing. One of the things you mentioned earlier was about your observation of jiu-jitsu as a skill set that police use. In the past 5 years, jiu-jitsu has become, I would say, a pseudo or quasi default martial art of policing. I say that because throughout the United States, police departments hire jiu-jitsu professors to either create small workshops or run workshops for their police that are specifically designed for police to accommodate their gear, to accommodate the legality, to accommodate the type of situations that people who do jiu-jitsu for competition would never encounter. And one of the things you mentioned was that when you think about jiu-jitsu, you think about a restraining energy and a restraining system of control and not punching. Surprisingly, police are allowed to punch. You can see it. I just saw a video of a person resisting, and one police officer begins and the other ones jump in. They are punching that person in the face, full punch, like if it was a boxing match. And I will tell you that as an observer, it's very unsettling because you want to believe that they are trained to not have to punch. And as we think about martial arts, I think that's what we want to invest in. Can we look at the police force as an institution that has opportunities to adjust their training so that they do not have to use maximum force, which is striking? And I mentioned earlier, there was a time they could use nunchucks. That's a devastating tool. There's very limited use of softness to that tool. Almost, and the soft version is the choking version. The hard version is the striking version. So I think that's where martial arts, I think that's where this conversation of martial arts is, that it's looking at policing and saying the institution of policing is heavily invested in the field of martial arts. And really martial arts has an opportunity to have a dialogue with police reform.
And it's really interesting that there's not more spaces, or the culture of, I guess, the so-called progressive folks and stuff like that. It doesn't seem like that people in that discourse is really into martial arts. I mean, this whole like anti-violence thing. I mean, it kind of becomes, I don't know. I here in the States, it doesn't seem to be that popular. I mean, I wish I had, I trained with more people that embraced the critical lens, that embraced, dissecting, mainstream culture and dominant structures. I mean, it's just, and yes, like martial arts, boxing, whatever, it's a thinking person's sport. It is, it's not a dumb person's sport by any means. And I feel that, I think it's good for people who are critical of I guess, dominant structures should embrace martial arts a little bit more. And, I always try to encourage people to train. Oh, it's great. It's such a, great way to exercise the body, the mind, and bring about more confidence and being in tune with the body. But I don't know. I mean, I can't change anybody's mind. But that's just something that's been on my mind ever since I started training.
I agree. I think martial arts as a space has historically been catered to to a very unique group of people. When I talk to martial artists that trained in the 60s and the 70s, they are very open of who trained with them. And it was hard men, very few women. And when I say hard men, that's the word that they said, tough guys. And they would tell me like, no, the training was legit. It was like, for example, it might have been Nishiyama in Shotokan who had come to the United States and was teaching Shotokan as he had learned it from Funikoshi, where it was almost a weeding out process. Only a few will make it to black belt. I'm not going to explain anything. I'm just watch it. I'm allowed to hit you. Like they would walk around with these wooden bamboo swords, which I got, Elliot, it's crazy. I'm thinking about my moment, and I got all those little moments because I had some of those instructors, and if your stance was wrong, they would come behind you with the shinai and whack you in the thigh. Pow! You would get slapped, or you would get pushed, and like there was a physical contact to it. And for some reason, people think fondly of it. And I can say that there's probably very beneficial outcomes to that training, but there's also a non-beneficial outcome where people leave who didn't have to leave. So when you push out that person that's intimidated, that's the one person you need in your dojo. Don't let them go. I always found it funny when like these massive people would train with me, because I was like, you don't need this martial art. You're like the size of a fridge already. What are you doing here with me? But for all I know, emotionally, they were people that needed that space. But physically, they were intimidating. And where we are right now is thinking about policing and its relationship to martial art training. And you mentioned that it's kind of interesting that, there aren't a lot of places where people feel comfortable training, because I think it has to do with how martial arts spaces have become a default space for safety for police officers. And it has come at an expense. There's silence for many of us that feel intimidated or concerned. I can comfortably say that I'm not scared of training with police officers. They've never hurt me. But I felt sad that when there was a moment of talking about police brutality, someone's death, that the dojo was the place that I couldn't go to and be honest. And if it is a place that I spend so much time with people that I care about and who care about me and who we invest, why can't we be open there too?
Well, with that said, this has been the Reroll Multiple Martial Arts Podcast, an intersection of martial arts, society, and culture. Demilitarize the police, defund the police, and keep them in check.